All right, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. So we'll get started here. So thank you so much for joining us for our virtual Leaders in Conservation event, Wetland Restoration on Pelee Island. My name is Tiffany Trinidad. If we haven't met, I'm the Development Officer and I manage Leaders in Conservation program, and I will be moderating today's event. So in a moment, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Jill Crosswaite, who will take us through some of the important work that we are doing on Pelee Island. But first, I'd actually like to start with a land acknowledgement. At the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we acknowledge that the work we do across the country is on the traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples. The area of focus today, which is Pelee Island, is within the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, and the Miami peoples. Since time immemorial, these communities have cared for the lands, plants, and animals here. So we want to make this acknowledgement with respect and gratitude for the histories, languages, cultures of Indigenous peoples who are with us today, those who have come before us, and those who come after us. NCC is dedicated to ensuring the spirit of the land is honored, and we're thankful for the continued presence of the Indigenous people in these areas today. Secondly, I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us on this webinar today. In particular, I'd like to thank our Leaders in Conservation donors. So for those who are maybe not familiar with the program who are joining us today, our Leaders in Conservation program is a group of dedicated supporters who support critical conservation work through the gift of an annual donation of $1,000 or more. These donations really help NCC provide a reliable source of funding that allows us to continue our stewardship efforts and undertake new projects. If you're not in this group and are interested in learning more, do reach out to me. I'd also like to thank all of our donors who have helped with this project in particular. There are, I think, a few of you on the call, Judith, Brian, Heather, there's a lot. I can't name all of you, but just know that your support is really appreciated. I'd also like to thank our volunteers as well as our board members. A couple are on the call. In particular, I'd like to give a shout out to Doug Vardy for his role supporting the LIC program as the board representative. And I'd also, last but not least, like to thank Ontario Power Generation. So Ontario Power Generation has generously supported our Leaders in Conservation event series, and they've been a great partner for our work over the years. So I do just have a couple of housekeeping notes that I'll mention before we get started. This event is being recorded. A link to the recording will be sent via email to you afterwards, and we invite you to revisit the recording and share it with colleagues, friends, and family, whoever might be interested in learning a bit more about the work that we do and the work that we're doing in Pelee Island. During the while we are presenting or while others are speaking, we do just ask that you remain on mute. It will help us hear each other. There will be a bit of a discussion at the end. There is also live closed captioning available. This is generated through the Zoom platform. So if this is something that you want to turn on, you can navigate to the menu at the bottom of your screen, and there's an option for a live transcript. And once this is enabled, you'll be able to also adjust the caption size as you need. So while we do ask you to stay on mute while others are talking. Please feel free to add your comments and questions in the chat at any time. I'd actually like to invite you to try this feature out now by just saying hi in the chat and letting us know where you're joining us from. And last thing I'll just mention, if we don't get to your question, if we run out of time at the end, or if you think of something after this afternoon, please do reach out. I have my email here. It's ontariolic@natureconservancy.ca. So please feel free to email me and I will make sure that your burning questions are addressed. So before I hand it off to Jill, I'd like to hand it off to Doug, if you'd like to say a couple words before we start.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. So on behalf of the Ontario Board, I also wanted to thank you, our leaders and other guests for your very generous support over the years. As Tiffany mentioned, your donations provide key funding to support the amazing conservation work we do here in Ontario. And as an aside, I can tell you it's been a very exciting year in Ontario with a number of large landscape projects that we've taken on. I think our last LIC event was on the Hastings Junction project, but there's another new one coming that you'll hear more about in the days to come. So pre-COVID, one of our quarterly board meetings was always held outside the GTA in an area where NCC was doing a lot of work. And likely now 3 to 4 years ago, our last such in-person event was held in Leamington, and we had a chance to hop across to Pelee Island and tour some of the NCC properties on Pelee Island. And at that point, I think NCC was just starting this major wetland restoration project. So I'm excited today to see how it's gone and what other interesting developments there are with respect to sort of our properties in the Pelee area. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tiffany or Jill.
Great, thanks so much, Doug. So I'll hand it right over to Jill. If you want to
Okay.
take over.
Thanks, Tiffany. Okay, bear with me here. There we go. All right, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to talk today about the Big Wetland Project on Pelee Island. And first of all, I'm the Coordinator of Conservation Biology for NCC's Southwestern Ontario subregion. So this means I mostly work on managing the stewardship of our conservation lands in Southern Ontario, focusing on Essex and Lambton County, and especially on Pelee Island. And this job is a really rewarding combination of both planning and hands-on work and getting to know the properties to identify what species are using them, figuring out what we need to do to best support the best habitat possible, and implementing the plans that we develop for these properties. So this can mean removing invasive species, improving trail systems, working with researchers to learn more about the species living there, and restoration of agricultural fields, which is really what I'm going to talk about today. And it's one of the most exciting parts of my job. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I'm sure many of you are familiar with us already, but we are the nation's leading not-for-profit land conservation organization. We have an extensive planning system to figure out exactly where we need to work to best protect our most important natural areas and the species that are living there. We've protected over 14 million hectares coast to coast and 84,000 hectares in Ontario alone. And I also want to touch on the United Nations Decade of Restoration, which really ties into this project really well. Restoration has always been an important part of our work at NCC, especially in Southwestern Ontario. The United Nations has declared the 2021 to 2030 as the Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So the goal of this is to restore healthy ecosystems, counteract climate change, and stop the collapse of biodiversity that we've been documenting lately, and also enhance people's livelihoods and really be able to support healthy ecosystems for us all. And an important note here is that 85% of the world's wetlands have been lost, and restoration of these is really vital to returning these ecosystems to the planet. So why wetlands? What's so special about them? They have a lot of important roles. Not only are they really important habitat for a ton of species, but they also play a really important role in managing water quality and quantity. So they slow water runoff, they allow sediments to sink to the bottom, while wetland plants filter out nutrients and pollutants. You may be familiar with the algal blooms in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario lately, and this is largely due to nutrients running off the soils and into the lake, feeding the algae instead of being retained on the land as they should be. Wetlands are also really important in managing water cycling. So while they hold the water on the land longer, this allows it to evaporate back into the atmosphere to come down as rain elsewhere, and also for it to slowly seep into the ground to recharge groundwater. And they're really critical for maintaining healthy landscapes and water and air for all of us. So restoration in Southern Ontario has really, we've focused mostly on what we call upland restoration, so meadows and forests, things like that. But we're starting to focus a little bit more on wetlands in recent years as well. And Southern Ontario or Southwestern Ontario is in what we call the Carolinian zone. So this is kind of stretches from Grand Bend over to Toronto and is a deciduous forest dominated kind of habitat. So this is things like maples and oaks and beeches instead of the things that we think about a little bit when we think about Northern Ontario, like the pines and spruces. So this is a really diverse area. There's a lot of species here, but there's also a lot of people. And this has led it to become very highly fragmented. So you can see on this map here that a lot of, there's some little bits of forest, but there's also a lot of agricultural fields. So this is kind of an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to make more and bigger habitat, to buffer streams and waterways, provide recreational opportunities like this trail coming through the fields here. And it also is an opportunity to directly mitigate effects of climate change. So one thing that restoration on these sites do is a lot of the prairie species and the tree species that we're planting will sequester carbon and directly reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But another cool factor of restoration is it actually reduces the temperature in these areas. So a researcher actually looked at, used thermal imagery from satellites to look at the temperature of our fields versus agricultural fields. And in the summer, there's a 4.5-degree difference in these fields. And the more species you get in them, the lower the temperature. So it's something that it's a really direct impact that we can have just by doing restoration on these areas. Within Southwestern Ontario, we've restored about 870 hectares, which is really quite an impressive amount. Almost 100 hectares of that is on Pelee Island. And this is kind of a long ongoing process. And we start out by planting about 30 to 100 species of native plants in these areas. And one of the most rewarding things is seeing the wildlife return to these areas. Areas that were once barren are suddenly teeming with pollinators, with insects and birds, snakes, foxes, all kinds of things. And an important note as well that some of you may already be familiar with is that the diversity of plant species is really important for maintaining all of our birds. So a lot of birds, almost all of our songbirds, even hummingbirds, are feeding their babies with insects. So a pair of chickadees may need to feed 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of eggs. So that's a lot of caterpillars, and you need a lot of plants to produce all of these insects. Many people are probably familiar with the monarch butterfly that you can see here, feeding on a swamp milkweed, and this species only eats milkweeds. So you need to have milkweeds to get monarchs. And that's not unique among insects. You need many insect species are really dependent on one species of plant. So if you want to have lots of insects and lots of birds, you need lots of different types of plants. So to talk more about Pelee Island specifically, it is very nearly the southernmost point in Canada. If you're not familiar with it, it's down in the western basin of Lake Erie here in this circle. And while we may think of Canada as being the Great White North, Pelee Island is not so much. It's on just about the same latitude as Northern California, in fact. So it's really quite far south and a very mild climate compared to a lot of places in Canada. This mild climate, along with some other kind of key features of it, like rare habitats, mean that it has a ton of biodiversity. It is an incredibly cool place. There's over 200 track species. So these are species that are considered rare or uncommon in Canada or Ontario. And we know that those are found on Pelee Island. And it's also, these rare habitats that it supports include things like alvar, which are globally rare. So this is really shallow soil over limestone. It supports kind of a unique type of habitat, unique species. And it also has all these coastal sand beaches that are really globally rare and freshwater coastal marshes, all kinds of really unique habitat in these really deciduous dominated forests. And it also has this really large percent of protected areas. So while Pelee Island is inhabited, you can go there, you can drive around. There's also almost 20% of the island is protected for nature, which is really exciting and provides a lot of opportunities for protecting these species. So it has all these incredible wildflower displays, and that's a big part of that is from the, because of the deciduous dominated forest, you end up with this opportunity for flowers to really do their thing in the early spring. So we call those spring ephemerals. They show up before the trees have opened up their leaves. So you get really amazing displays of these guys. And it's also, because it's located in the middle of Lake Erie, it's an amazing stopover spot for migrating birds. So birds are overwintering down in Central and South America and then flying up to their breeding habitats, maybe in the boreal, and they need to cross the Great Lakes. And Pelee Island is one of the spots that they can stop to refuel as they're doing this. Many of you may be familiar as well with Point Pelee being this kind of globally recognized important spot where you can go and see all kinds of birds. A lot of those birds are actually stopping on Pelee Island as well. So it's also a great spot to be seeing birds. And beyond that, it's just a really cool place to go. It's such a lush, it's right in the middle of the lake. It's warm, it's a very lush place. It's almost like a jungle. And there's also these amazing beaches. So it's really got some really interesting and unique features that make it an amazing place. So to kind of get back on track with wetlands, why are we making a wetland here in the middle of a lake? Historically, Pelee Island used to be mostly marsh. It was several small islands connected by marsh, and you can see on this left-hand side here that this shows the old island. So back in the late 1800s, it was drained by digging a series of quite deep canals across the island and installing pump houses to pump the water off the island to turn the whole thing back into land instead of marsh. So you can see on the right here, this is an aerial photograph, and you can see these areas that were marsh are actually now mostly farmland. So NCC properties are shown on both of these. There's green on the right here and then the borders over here. And really what we've done is prioritize protecting the remaining natural habitat on the island, which is mostly on those rocky islands that were too shallow to be able to farm. But we've also got this one field you can see circled here. This is the project site. So you can see there's actually the natural habitat is here, and then we've got the farm field, and you can see that farm field actually used to be marsh. So this is a really amazing opportunity for us to actually recreate some of that marsh habitat that was largely lost on the island. So what does this look like? Right here, this is kind of a before and after shot taken from the same spot. So on the left, you can see the field back in 2018 when we first started thinking seriously about what we're going to do on this field. And it's showing a soybean field. So the fields mostly on Pelee are being farmed in a rotation of soybeans and wheat. And on the right, it's the same view. You can kind of follow the tree line here to see the, to position yourself. And this is in fall 2021 after we've done our wetland work. And this is just the beginning. There's actually quite a bit more left to take place in this area. So this map kind of shows the field, an aerial photograph. Here's the edge of the forest here. Got a road here and a canal up here. And this came from the plan. We hired Ducks Unlimited in 2018, Ducks Unlimited Canada, to develop an engineered plan for turning most of the field, as much as we could, back into marsh. So that's about 25 hectares in total in the basin. So the plan involved a 1.5 kilometer berm right here, this dotted line, around the edge of the future wetland using the clay that was excavated from the field. So this is not only allowing us to construct a really solid berm, but it also allows us to use natural and local materials. And it created these deeper pockets as well. So these are eventually, when the wetland is full, will be deep enough that turtles can overwinter in them, which is a really important thing. You may or may not be aware, but turtles are one of our most at-risk species. All of our species of turtles in Southern Ontario are threatened in some way. So having some habitat for them was really important. So once we had this plan in 2018, we also had an idea of what it was going to cost to build us. So in 2019, we kind of went into fundraising mode and raised the money for this. Thank you to many of you who are on this call who contributed to that. And then in 2020, we were actually ready to go and start building the field or building the wetland. So how is it possible to farm soybeans in an area that was marsh? And how do you make that area hold water once again? So a big part of that is actually drainage tiles. So this field had a grid of ceramic tiles installed in the field, and they would carry the water quickly off the field and into the canal where it could be pumped out. So to get the area to hold water again, we couldn't just build a berm because the water would just flow out underneath the berm. So the contractor had to go and carefully find all of these tiles and break them to make sure that the water would stay on the field within the basin created by the berm. So in 2020, we started construction. It was fall 2020, we actually got on the ground. And building a berm that big, doing all of this work took multiple months. You can see here, this is an excavator pulling soil out of one of those borrow areas, as we call them, within the basin of the wetland, and then they put it in the dump truck. They truck it all the way across to where the berm is going to be, and another excavator and bulldozers would shape it into the size and shape that we wanted according to the engineered drawings. So this as well on the right here, there's a little turtle that I made out of the clay that they were building the berm out of. And this is sort of a little reassurance to me. So one thing that we found really quickly, once those tiles were broken, once it started to rain, these areas filled with water and they have not been dry since. And this little clay turtle has been sitting in the front of my van since fall 2020 and has been rattling around completely undisturbed. And that's a really great reassurance that the berm is going to be really solid. This thing is, 5 meters wide and it's made out of really solid clay. So we know it's going to be able to hold the hundreds of thousands of liters that this wetland is eventually going to have in it. So we're still in early days, even though the construction is complete and there's a lot of water being held just from breaking those tiles. We still have a long way to go. So right now there's about 8 hectares of wetland habitat water that's being held in there, but we need to get up to 25, or that's the goal from the original design. And the way that we're managing this, we don't want it to all kind of come down at once, or we're going to end up with a lot of erosion issues and the berm may not be ready. So we have a way of maintaining and managing water. So what you see on the left is an agri-drain, it's called. So this is installed into the berm. Water flows in one side. There's a series of vertical planks in there. It flows up and then it flows over and then out the other side. So you can see in the middle, this is the agri-drain at the top. And I'm installing one of the inaugural planks in here. Right now, we only have 2 planks in it. We're going to be leaving them slowly over the next. In the spring, we'll start adding maybe 1 a month or so, letting the water rise a little bit, see what it's doing, make sure everything's stable, then maybe let it rise a little more. And this is an area where we don't have an inlet of water. There's no water coming from a stream or creek or anything like that. It's just rainwater coming from the sky and snow melt and that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see over time how quickly it fills as we slowly build it up as well. So even though this is a really early stage of the project, we have seen some really amazing, really exciting success stories on this site. So one of those is Scarlet Amania. So this is an endangered plant. It is found in only a couple places in Canada and a couple places in Ontario, including Pelee Island. And some of the populations that we know about from the past are actually we know are gone now, either because of invasive Phragmites or development or other things. But when we built this wetland, we got thousands of plants. You can see one right here showing off why it's called Scarlet Amania. And they're pretty much scattered throughout the whole floodplain of our wetland right now, or they were in the fall. So that's a really exciting thing to see after such a short period of time that we are getting endangered species like this. And not only are we getting endangered plants, we're also getting endangered salamanders. So we have one of the things, the components of this project was actually digging breeding ponds for salamanders along the edge of the field above the water line of the main basin. So there's been researchers from the Trent University who have been studying the population of endangered smallmouth salamander on Pelee since 2015. And one of the things that they've learned while they've been studying these populations is that breeding ponds are probably one of the limiting factors. And also they've worked out what makes a good breeding pond as well. So we took those recommendations on board and we built some. And in the first year, we had successful rearing of salamanders from those ponds. So salamanders are amphibians and they're terrestrial most of their lives. They hang out in the woods, and then in early March, there might still be snow on the ground. They trundle across the snow and find a breeding pond like this one here. Lay their eggs. The little babies start to develop and grow eventually into terrestrial adults. And this is one that's sort of partway in between. It's got legs, but it's still got gills and fins. And this one over here is a little recently emerged metamorph, as they're called. So this was a really exciting thing to see, again, that you can build habitat and they will come very quickly within just a few months of actually making it. And that's one of the really cool things about Pelee too, is that the life is just ready to spring out of the ground in some cases. So despite having done the main part of the construction, restoration is kind of this long process that needs a lot of work, especially in the first few years. So we planted a lot of native species on this site, and that takes quite a bit of time to get established. And in the meantime, there's a lot of disturbance, a lot of exposed soil and places where invasive species that tend to really like disturbed areas can get a stronghold. Species like Phragmites and creeping thistle think this is perfect. And we've already been removing these from this field, and we're going to continue doing that like we do with all of our properties, maintaining and making sure that this continues to be good habitat into the future. We're also going to be monitoring the water levels in the next few years, especially, and making some decisions about how we want to manage them in the future. There's opportunities to potentially drop them so that we get mud flats in the spring for migrating shorebirds. That's one of those key habitats that there's not a lot of it left in the landscape. So that may be something that we're able to do with this wetland as well. We're also going to have to keep a close eye on our water control structure. This is the inlet here. After only a year, a beaver has found its nice home in our nice wetland. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that and continually keep that open as long as there's water flowing through. So there's a lot of stuff to do on this as well. Now, when it comes to next steps, big steps that we want to take with this project, the one that we're really excited about is building some visitor infrastructure and getting people onto the site. This is an amazing project. We want to be able to bring people to it, let people, islanders as well as tourists, to come and see this and really make it a feature because it is a really impressive project. So one of the things we want to do is to build a accessible wildlife blind, kind of like what you see on the right here. So this is just a wooden structure, fairly basic, that allows people to approach the wildlife or approach the wetland from a kind of covered area so that you don't spook the wildlife. And then you can sit in there and watch, photograph, whatever you want to do for some time without ever disturbing the wildlife. And we're also going to be connecting there's an existing trail quite nearby. We're going to extend a loop around this wetland as well so that people can come and walk on it and do quite a long loop as well on the island. So another exciting next step is that we've been working with a local nursery to grow Pelee Island seeds and plugs to plant around the wetland. So all of our restoration plantings that we do on Pelee are from seeds that we've collected by hand on the island. So this is in part because it's available. We can go out and find them. We don't have to pay for it. But a big part is that we want to keep everything local. It is an island. There may be some unique features, genetic features of the plants that are growing there. And we want to maintain that. And also it has a unique climate, so better adapted to it than some of these species. And you would be getting a kind of a little bit more information from it and kind of a private tour as well when you come out to help us. And I also, this is kind of an opportunity to plug the island in general. There is a ton of bed and breakfasts, cottage rentals. There's a great bakery. There's a Pelee Island winery. You can rent bikes and bike around the island. Makes a nice little weekend vacation. So if you wanted to build that around your the volunteer event, that would be a great idea as well. So just kind of to tie it off, I want to encourage you to get involved, not just with those volunteer events that we have on Pelee Island, but we have volunteer events across the country. So there's lots of opportunities to volunteer with us. If you're not close to Pelee or you can't make it out there, keep an eye on our website. Our volunteer events are all advertised there, so there's always opportunities to get involved that way. And I also really want to say thank you so much for all of your support so far. All of this work wouldn't be possible without the donations and our amazing donors. We really appreciate any and all donations, and thank you for everyone for what you've contributed so far. Just a little bit of a plug as well. The other thing that you can do even on your own property without even having to have anything to do with NCC is you can plant native plants. Wildlife will thank you very much for this. You can start small, and native plants are more and more available at nurseries. So I really encourage you to give that a try as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Tiffany to moderate questions.
Great, thanks so much, Jill. So I'll just stop sharing my screen and I'll take a look at any questions we have in the chat. Right, so the first question I see here is from Tony, and they ask, are you having a bird festival this spring?
Hi, so NCC isn't hosting a bird festival, but if you're referring to the Spring Song event, that's typically hosted by the Pelee Island Heritage Center, they may be doing another virtual event. I'm not sure it's been decided yet whether it will be virtual or in person. Hopefully it'll be in person. Myself and some other staff have been doing the bird race for the past few years, so I would be really excited to go back and do that again.
All right. I have another question from Anne, and her question is, build habitat and they will come, but only if there is a residual population somewhere nearby or a residual seedbed. Are there some species that you're going to need to bring back in other ways?
That's a great question. So on Pelee, we're really lucky that it is a fairly small area and there is a lot of natural habitat left. So there's a lot of source populations for rare species. So for example, with the salamanders, we knew from what the researchers had done that there were adults in the forest next to the field. They just didn't have anywhere to breed. So they were maybe dispersing from other areas or maybe making a really long trek to find a breeding pond. So we knew that when we did that, we would get, well, we hoped anyway, and we were successful, that we would get salamanders to breed there. And also with wetlands as well, knowing that this was all marsh, the seed bank is usually pretty good. We find wetland plants will often come, even if it's decades old, we'll find wetland plants popping up. I would say we're not at the point, we wouldn't be reintroducing manually animals. We do plant lots of species. As I mentioned, we plant about 30 species of locally collected native plants from around the island. Now, some of these would eventually get there on their own, but it's a slow process. And because we're starting with a blank slate, if we wait for things to fill in naturally, it'll fill in with the really weedy stuff. And some of that is invasive. Like I mentioned, Phragmites and creeping thistle and white sweet clover and all of these other species would tend to come in there and take up the habitat before the native stuff gets there. So we give that a little bit of a jump start that way. And then the animals will find it on their own, even if it takes a few years. We don't necessarily expect turtles in the first year, but they will eventually get there. And we'll be keeping an eye on it for, you know, forever. So if we see that there are things that we really think are missing, or that there's issues that we want to fix, then we're going to be watching, and we can make that plan.
Great. I see Doug Finley has his hand up, so maybe we'll take your question and then we'll jump back to the questions in the chat here.
Thanks. Yeah, Jill, it just looks spectacular, the work you've done, and I sure hope I can come and help plant some of those oak plugs and other things in the spring. I apologize if my question is a bit out of scope, because it's more of an engineering question than a conservation question, but you talked about the berm, and I would have thought, obviously wrongly, that once you dealt with the drainage tiles and sort of let the rain fall and let the lake come back in, that would have sort of recreated the wetland conditions. Are you able to explain why the berm had to be built?
Yeah, of course. So the field is bordered by a road on two sides and a canal on the north side. So even if we could break all the tiles, but the water is still going to run off into the ditches that border two sides, just because of the way the water comes out. And we would, by breaking the tiles, we would have held some water on there. It would still be wet, but if we wanted open water, something that's representative of the massive marsh that once would have been on Pelee, we needed to build a berm, because those drainage areas are sitting there still taking overland flow away. And it's kind of a very gradual slope down towards those areas, rather than a swoop where we could break it and have it held within that area. Does that make sense?
Great. So I'll jump back to the chat here. So Doug Vardy is asking, will there be CV events in the spring? If you want to address that.
Yes, there will. So we are going to be hosting events to plant the acorns and, the chinkapin oaks and the wetland plugs that we've been growing up. So those will be posted on our website, and we'll be advertising those once we get some of the details ironed out for when those are going to take place. We really hope they will. I mean, COVID has kind of made things a little bit unpredictable, but we're really hoping we can get back into volunteer events this spring.
Great, thanks, Jill. I have a question from Jim here. Did you do any environmental impact studies as part of coming up with the design for the restoration?
So because we're working on an agricultural field, we actually don't need to go into the detailed species at risk screening. So we've done projects where we do need to work with looking at what species are using the area and figuring out whether we need to, what steps we need to take to make sure that we're doing things the right way. In this case, we did have to get a permit from the Conservation Authority, which is mostly looking at how it might impact water and flooding. But we don't need to worry, because there wasn't habitat there. It was a soybean field. We didn't need to worry about impacting habitat in that way. So that saved us a lot of time that way.
Great, thanks. So I have a couple questions about how we fund our projects. So maybe I see Jill Murray on the screen. Did you want to answer that one?
Sure. Can you hear me? Great. I mean, it's a great question. And hi, everyone. Hi, Margaret. Hi, Doug. It's lovely to see everyone here. I mean, obviously, we did a shout out at the start to OPG, and I just want to say thank you to them. But when it comes to actually funding our work and stewardship work like this, it's a combination. I think most people on the call know that we have a stewardship endowment fund. And when we acquire lands, about 20% of the land value goes into this long-term stewardship endowment to help support our staff and our stewardship work. Over time, we've kind of figured out that only covers roughly 50% of our ongoing costs. Invasive species are getting bigger or are becoming more of a problem, and there's just a lot of work to do. When you have amazing projects like Jill and her team are running, creating wetlands of this size, we actually have to go out and do additional fundraising, because as you could imagine, that costs a little bit more money than we might have been planning on. So it's a combination of donors like yourselves funding it, our historical endowment fund helping to support it, and then sort of local communities and other people who are interested in maybe wetlands or Pelee Island coming together to help us. And yeah, I mean, Pelee Island is just a fantastic place where we've been working for so long and have real results to show on the ground, which always helps people show how their donations are actually delivering results.
Great, thanks, Jill. I have a couple of questions, more questions here. John and Barb ask, is restoring Lake Smith near Grand Bend something we'd get involved in?
So that's currently not one of our property areas. So we have a number of properties in the kind of Pinery to Kettle Point area, but we don't have what we call a natural area conservation plan for that area. And those are typically areas that we really focus our work on. We've had a lot of priorities in other places, so that hasn't been something that we've been looking at. It's certainly an important area, and it's worthy of consideration anyway. And I am hoping that in the future we'll be able to do a bit more work in that area. But for now we have a lot going on in Pelee and Norfolk and some of these big new projects that we've been focusing our efforts on in the Boreal as well.
Doug has another question. You talked a bit about managing invasive species on Pelee. So Doug is just asking, are there Phragmites on Pelee?
Yes, there are. Unfortunately, there's Phragmites everywhere. So it's actually it's somewhat managed on the island. There's a couple of bigger populations that we've worked with Ontario Parks to help control, but it's a slow process, and it's often been in standing water. The township's been awesome. They actually had all of the drains treated for Phragmites. So there's, as I mentioned, that canal system and a lot of roadside ditches with a lot of water. Anywhere where it was dry and there was Phragmites, they treated it just a couple of years ago. So that was great. And we are keeping on top of it as much as we can in our new projects too. So it's definitely a concern, but we're managing it.
I have a couple of questions from Michaela. So I'm just gonna ask them together because they're kind of related. They say, how long do you expect the ongoing stewardship will last? What role, will the role of volunteers develop over time? Also, what are you measuring your success against, and is there an ideal marsh?
Well, good questions. So ongoing stewardship. So we are a forever organization. We acquire properties and we are committed to managing them forever. So there's always going to be taxes and other things. With something like this, with a new project that where, as I mentioned, a lot of disturbance has taken place, there's kind of a big initial investment. So we have to spend a lot of time working on managing invasive species. And there's a lot of time kind of working out with this as well, exactly what it is that how it's behaving and whether there's any modifications we need to make. With our other restoration sites on the islands, I mentioned we started in 2009. Those are doing pretty well. They don't need a lot of additional management at this point, but we are also always working with researchers to kind of figure out what do the species on the island need. So, making sure that we have habitat for all of these rare species and making sure that we're managing the habitat we do have for them. So there may be situations where it makes sense to do a burn, for example, every 5 or 10 years so that we can maintain open habitat gaps for snakes. Other areas we might allow to turn into forest. So depending on the place, depending on what invasive species there are, whether or not we want to have people on it. So we know we're putting in visitor infrastructure, a trail and a blind. So that's going to be forever infrastructure we have to monitor and manage. And sorry, role of volunteers. Yeah, so that will change as well. There's often, when in an early stage, there's a lot of planting events. Something we've done in the past, but we haven't been able to so much lately, is shoreline cleanups. So there's always garbage washing up on the beaches. So we always need people to come out and do that. Sometimes we do invasive species removal events. So yeah, there's all kinds of things that we might need volunteers for, and those, as we develop them into events, will end up on the website as well. Was that all the questions? Was there something else that I
think
missed?
so.
Sorry.
I had just asked about is there an ideal marsh? Like how do you know when you've achieved the marsh that you want to create?
Marsh of my dreams. I guess it's hard to say. I wouldn't say that there is an ideal marsh. There's so many different types, different species, depending on where you are and what species are in the area and what the options are. You know, in my mind, an ideal marsh is one that is free of invasive species, has a diversity of habitat. There's open water, there's vegetated areas, there's a nice big littoral zone. Maybe there's a little bit of swamp in one corner. So there's a diversity of habitat to support all kinds of species. It can be easy to sort of dream about what I want to see 100 years from now on this site, but nature has its own ideas as well. So we also need to be aware that even if we come up with a plan for exactly what we want, it may take a different direction as well. So there's room to let nature decide a little bit as well.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question? I know that I've asked a lot of questions. I just I'm videoing in from the UK, and I'm from Canada, but I've been living here for a while, and I'm a volunteer here. And it seems like it's the opposite here, where people are like kind of micromanaging habitats and like seeding rare plants and constantly like scything and like cutting back certain species and planting other species, and the management is very heavy. And I'm just wondering, like, if you're an ecologist, how do you make that call, whether just to sort of let nature do its thing or whether you're going to try to micromanage?
Right. It's a difficult decision, I think, and it's going to be highly variable. I think one thing in the UK is that it's been impacted by people for a really, really, really long time. Whereas in Canada, while Southern Ontario has had like pretty intensive human impact since Europeans arrived on the scene, there's still a lot of nature there. So a lot of the species that we want to see on the site are still on the island. They're fairly close, so we expect them to get there. You know, there may be restoration efforts. There might be fire that takes, you know, things like that that need to maintain open habitat. There's a disturbance we may need to bring in. But I think we're maybe a little bit better place to be able to let nature take its course when it's a little bit not quite so far removed from whatever the natural course of things was. It's certainly something, you know, we really, one of the things that I really like is being able to work with researchers so they can kind of help us, guide us as well on those specific areas, because sometimes what you learn in one area is not necessarily what applies to your specific area. And of course, from my perspective as a land manager, the less actual work that we have to do, the less interference we can do, the better. And it's hopefully going to be a more stable system if we don't have to keep interfering. But it's definitely a complicated question.
Great. Okay, I have a bunch of questions. We'll try to get through a bunch of them. So the next question I have is from Gordon. What kind of fish species, if any, would you expect to find their way on to this property?
That is a great question. I am not a fishologist, or ichthyologist, I guess is the technical term. So this is definitely one of less of my areas of expertise, but something that we have found is that fish will make their way into any of our wetlands on Pelee on their own. The salamander researchers have caught a lot of different types of minnows. Catfish are one. I think I actually found a fairly large bullhead catfish in this wetland. It was dead. Maybe a bird dropped it. But I would expect that we're going to have catfish fairly early on. I would expect a number of minnows as well. There are rare species that are known from Pelee Island, and I hope they will find their way there. Things like lake chubsucker might be something that would like this sort of habitat. And, you know, it's hopefully something that we can have some fish biologists actually take a look at and see what's appearing. Because I absolutely know that there are going to be fish in there, and there is going to be some kind of fish population and potentially mussels as well. There's quite a lot of rare mussels from the area. A lot of them are dependent on fish species. I would expect there being some bluegills and sunfishes, that sort of thing, would like this habitat. And there's some rare species like lilliput mussels that need those guys for as part of their development. So I would hope that with some time, this will become habitat for some of those species as well.
Great. Okay, I have 3 more questions for you. Are there any interesting lichen species on the island?
Yes, there are. So we don't know any from this project, and I am also not a lichenologist, but we did have a lichen researcher on our Stone Road Alvar properties. We've been working with some of the other conservation organizations. Ontario Nature has been doing a burn on their property and using our property and the Conservation Authority properties nearby as kind of control sites. So Troy McMillan came out. He's a experienced lichen person and has been identifying lichens, and I wish I could tell you the names of them. I cannot off the top of my hand, but he found 4 rare species on that property. There wasn't much of a list of species for the island, so it was kind of a neat addition to what we know about the island, that there's 4 rare species. I think there are about 30 altogether, maybe 1 new record for Canada. So yes, there are. And if you are interested in that list, send me an email and I can send it to you.
And okay, next question. Is there anything that you've seen that motivates landowners to convert their properties to more biodiverse areas?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different programs to try and encourage people to do this. I think a lot of it is people getting excited about nature and wanting to do it on their own. There's definitely a huge aspect of that. People who are creating areas. There's somebody recently moved to the island who's really into butterflies. So she's, working on getting butterflies on her property. There's some nature focused people who are going, all right, I want to make a pond. I want to plant some native species. There are some of the programs on the mainland include the ALICE program, or Alternative Land Use Services, and it pays it actually pays to encourage landowners to restore sections. So it's often kind of not ideal farmland already. Maybe it's too wet, maybe it's next to a creek. And you could, they might install a wetland or do pollinator habitat to help encourage whatever it is that they're trying to grow. Often some species, soybeans not so much, but a lot of crops actually need pollinators, and there's a lot of evidence that if you have a nice diverse strip of native species nearby, you get more pollinators and more insect predators, and you get better results from your crops. So there can be incentives that way, both the monetary one and also just people being really keen on doing what is right for the property and maybe trying to get a little bit of nature back.
Great. Okay, I have one last question that was sent to me. Has there been any thought given to what might happen to our projects on Pelee Island if there were significant rise in the level of water from Lake Erie?
It's something to think about, but that's really one of those things that is out of our control. If it was significant enough to overtop the efforts that the municipality and the local landowners are doing to protect the shoreline, we would have, those original islands are islands. They would probably stay as islands. Maybe you could go set in the inside of the wetland and the berm would keep the water out. But it's not something that we have, we're not at this point seriously concerned about it. It's the water now seems to be coming back down again as well. And it really is one of those natural fluctuations. If it does happen, it happens. We're not going to try and pump the water out. But certainly we support the people who live there trying to protect their assets as well and provide natural habitat that can hopefully help buffer some of the potential climate fluctuations that may be causing some of these changes. But that's a good question.
Great, thanks so much for answering those questions. We're coming to time, so I guess we'll wrap this up. If you have any questions that you think of after the fact, please email me and I'll make sure that your question is addressed. But at this time, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for our event. As I mentioned earlier, in our session. I'll send out a follow-up email. I'll send out the recording and any additional resources that we have based on the stuff that we talked about this afternoon. We will also be announcing our next LIC events in the coming months, so please stay tuned for that. Again, if you aren't currently a leader in conservation and you're interested in learning more about the program, or if you're interested in supporting our work on Pelee, please do reach out to me as well. If you would like to receive regular email updates from NCC, or if you want to receive updates specifically about our volunteer events when those are announced, you can do so on our website, and I'll include a link in the email as well, so you can sign up for those. Other than that, thank you so much. I hope to see you all at our next LIC event, and I can't wait until we can all be together in person again. All right, thanks so much.